When he sat alone, ignored without service for nearly an hour, nobody noticed the dignified old man in the worn veteran's cap, his steady hands, his watchful eyes. Then something extraordinary happened. A four-star general entered the restaurant, spotted the elderly veteran, and froze in disbelief. Colonel Coleman? Their eyes met across the room. Everything changed, because some debts can never be repaid, and some heroes are hiding in plain sight. Richard Coleman adjusted his faded veteran's cap as he stepped through the glass doors of Bellamy's Steakhouse. At 73, his body carried the weight of his years of service. A slight limp from shrapnel that doctors could never fully remove. Shoulders squared from decades of military bearing despite the arthritis that now plagued them. His blue button-down shirt was clean but worn at the cuffs, his khaki pants pressed with precision that spoke of old habits. Outside, rain pelted the windows of the upscale restaurant, reflecting the dim glow of chandeliers onto the polished marble floors. Richard had chosen Bellamy's deliberately for this day, the 50th anniversary of when he'd pulled 3 men from a burning helicopter under enemy fire. He didn't celebrate the date publicly. It was a private remembrance, a quiet meal to honor brothers who hadn't made it home. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" The hostess, a young woman with immaculately styled hair, regarded him with a quick, dismissive glance. "No, ma'am. Just a table for one, please." Richard's voice carried the gentle cadence of rural Alabama, soft but clear. The hostess tapped her manicured nails against the reservation screen. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked tonight." Her eyes drifted past him to the door as it opened again, revealing a couple in designer clothes. "Welcome to Bellamy's," she called out with sudden warmth. "Your table is ready, Mr. and Mrs. Davidson." Richard stepped aside, noting multiple empty tables visible throughout the restaurant. "Pardon me, miss, but I can see several available tables. I don't mind waiting a bit if needed." The manager, a man in his 40s with a perpetual frown etched into his face, approached. "Is there a problem here, Jessica? This gentleman doesn't have a reservation but insists on a table," she replied, emphasizing gentleman with a tone that suggested Richard was anything but. The manager, whose nameplate read Blake Wilson, assessed Richard with cold efficiency. "Sir, we cater to a certain clientele here. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street? They don't require reservations." A couple seated nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. An older waitress looked away, busying herself with folding napkins. "I understand the value of reservations, Mr. Wilson," Richard replied evenly. "I'm not asking for special treatment, just a meal on an important day to me." His weathered hands remained steady at his sides. No trembling, no clenched fists, just the patient stillness of a man who had endured far worse than social slights. "Important day?" Wilson scoffed. "What? Did you find a quarter on the sidewalk?" A few patrons at the bar snickered. Richard didn't respond to the jab. Instead, he stood straighter, his eyes, sharp despite his age, holding the manager's gaze without challenge or submission. Just observation. The rain outside intensified, matching the darkening atmosphere within. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Wilson continued, gesturing toward the door. "We have a dress code and reservation policy." "I see." Richard nodded once. "Though I note several gentlemen dining now in attire similar to mine." Wilson stepped closer, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "Listen, old man, I don't need some vagrant veteran driving away my paying customers. The bar down the block serves your kind. Take your worst stories there." The words hung in the air, loud enough that several nearby tables fell silent. Richard's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes, a flicker of resignation rather than surprise, suggested this wasn't the first time he'd faced such treatment. A young server approached tentatively. "Mr. Wilson, there's actually a table available in my section." "Stay out of this, Tyler," Wilson snapped. "Get back to your tables." Tyler, no more than 25, hesitated, looking between Richard and his boss. Finally, with a muttered "Sorry, sir," he retreated. Richard removed his cap, revealing close-cropped silver hair. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his dignity intact despite the humiliation being inflicted. He turned to leave, his movements deliberately measured despite his limp becoming more pronounced with fatigue. "That's right. The American Legion probably has cheap beer for you vets anyway," Wilson called after him. just loud enough to be heard. Richard paused at the door, hand on the handle. The rain had turned into a downpour, sheets of water cascading from a darkened sky. He had walked 6 blocks to get here, his old truck having finally given up the ghost last month. Now he faced a long, wet walk with nothing but rejection to show for it. "Sir," a woman's voice called from a nearby table. She was in her 60s, dining alone with a glass of white wine. "I have an umbrella you can borrow." Richard smiled gently. "Thank you, ma'am, but I've weathered worse storms." As he pushed open the door, letting in the sound of pouring rain and distant thunder, a black SUV with government plates pulled up to the curb. The driver hurried out with an umbrella, rushing toward the entrance. Richard stepped aside to let the new arrivals enter, not noticing how the driver's eyes widened in recognition as they passed each other. He pulled his collar up against the rain and limped down the first step. Behind him, the restaurant door opened again. "Colonel Coleman?" a deep voice called through the rain. "Richard Coleman, 5th Special Forces, Dong APBA, 1969? Richard turned slowly, rain already soaking through his cap and shoulders. In the doorway stood a tall figure in a formal military uniform adorned with gleaming medals, for stars catching the light from inside. "My God," the general said, loud enough to be heard by everyone inside. "It really is you." Richard squinted through the rain, recognition dawning slowly on his face. The years had changed them both, but there was no mistaking the commanding presence before him. The general's face had new lines. His hair was now silver instead of black, but the eyes remained the same, determined, intelligent, and currently wide with disbelief. "Lieutenant Harrington?" Richard said, using the rank from 5 decades prior. "James Harrington." By now, patrons were craning their necks to see the commotion at the entrance. The manager, Wilson, pushed his way forward, plastering on his most obsequious smile. "General, welcome to Bellamy's. Your table is ready in our private dining area. We're honored to have you with us tonight." He positioned himself between Richard and the general, as if trying to shield the distinguished guest from the soaking wet veteran. The general ignored him completely, stepping into the rain without hesitation. His aide scrambled to follow with an umbrella, but Harrington was already halfway to Richard, hand extended. "Colonel Coleman, I thought you were dead." His voice carried a mixture of awe and deep emotion. "Not yet, sir," Richard replied with the ghost of a smile, though not for lack of trying on the enemy's part. The two men clasped hands firmly, a handshake that spoke volumes about shared experiences that most civilians could never understand. The general's aide finally caught up, holding the umbrella over both men. "Sir, you're getting soaked," the aide protested. "I've been through worse with this man," General Harrington replied, not taking his eyes off Richard. "Much worse." Inside, whispers rippled through the restaurant. A woman at the bar pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, while others openly stared. The hostess who had dismissed Richard earlier turned pale, suddenly finding great interest in her reservation screen. "Come inside, Colonel," the general said. "Join me for dinner." Richard hesitated. "I appreciate the offer, General, but I don't want to impose on your evening." "Impose?" General Harrington laughed, a sound carrying decades of military command. "The day Richard Coleman imposes on me is the day I hand in my stars. You're dining with me tonight. That's an order." As they entered the restaurant, the manager rushed forward again. "General Harrington, your private dining room will no longer be necessary." The general cut him off. "The colonel and I will dine in the main room. Your best table, if you please." Wilson's face twitched with barely concealed panic. "Of course, General. Right away." He snapped his fingers at the hostess. "Jessica, the corner table by the window." Jessica hurried to prepare the table, avoiding eye contact with Richard. Around the restaurant, conversations had fallen to hushed murmurs, all attention focused on the strange scene unfolding. A 4-star general treating a bedraggled elderly man with profound respect. Near the bar, an older gentleman in his 60s nudged his companion. "That's Coleman. Richard Coleman." His friend looked blank. "Should I know that name?" "If you served, you would," came the reply. "Medal of Honor recipient. Vietnam." The whispers spread faster now, snippets of information, some accurate, some exaggerated, moving from table to table like wildfire. As they were seated, Richard still dripping from the rain, a server rushed over with fresh napkins. It was Tyler, the young man who had tried to intervene earlier. "Sir," he addressed Richard directly. "Can I bring you a towel for your hair?" "Thank you, son," Richard replied with quiet gratitude. General Harrington removed his uniform jacket and draped it over the back of his chair, revealing a chest full of medals and ribbons. "Get the colonel whatever he wants, on my tab, and a bottle of your best bourbon." "Yes, sir, General," Tyler responded with the instinctive respect of someone who recognized authority. Across the restaurant, Wilson hovered anxiously, visibly calculating how to manage this unexpected situation. He finally approached their table with a forced smile. "General Harrington, it's such an honor to have you with us tonight. Please accept my apologies for any confusion at the door." "Confusion?" The general's voice was dangerously soft. "I observed no confusion, Mr. Wilson. I saw deliberate disrespect toward a decorated combat veteran." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "James, General, it's not necessary." "It is absolutely necessary," Harrington interrupted, his gaze never leaving Wilson's increasingly pale face. "This man saved my life and the lives of 14 others during the Battle of Hamburger Hill, while you were busy turning away a Medal of Honor recipient. Did you even consider who he might be?" Wilson's mouth opened and closed without sound. Around them, the restaurant had fallen completely silent, every ear straining to catch the conversation. We had no way of knowing." Wilson began weakly. "That's exactly right," the general said, his voice growing louder. "You had no way of knowing who he was because you didn't bother to find out. You saw an older man in simple clothes and made assumptions about his worth." At a nearby table, a woman in her 30s stood up. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice slightly trembling. "Did you say Medal of Honor?" General Harrington looked at Richard, who gave a small, reluctant nod. "Yes, ma'am," the general confirmed. "Colonel Richard Coleman was awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in combat. When our helicopter was shot down behind enemy lines, he carried 3 wounded men, myself included, through hostile territory for 11 hours to reach safety, despite being wounded himself." A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Tyler, who had returned with a clean towel, stood frozen in place, staring at Richard with newfound awe. "That's not the full story," Richard said quietly, accepting the towel with a nod of thanks. "No, it isn't," the general agreed, his eyes filling with emotion. "Because after he got us to the extraction point, he went back for 2 more men. Alone, against orders." The restaurant remained silent. The only sounds the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the distant clink of glassware from the kitchen. In that moment, the atmosphere had transformed from one of exclusivity and pretension to something more sacred, a place where history and sacrifice were suddenly, uncomfortably present. Richard's hands, steady and weathered, folded the towel neatly after drying his face. "It was a long time ago," he said simply. "Not to those of us who lived because of you," the general replied. Wilson stood awkwardly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "General, Colonel, please allow me to comp your meals tonight as a small token of gratitude for your service." Before either military man could respond, the older woman who had offered Richard her umbrella approached their table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "My husband was in Vietnam, 101st Airborne. He didn't come home." She turned to Wilson. "I was disgusted by how you treated this gentleman earlier. A free meal doesn't erase that kind of disrespect." Others began to stand. First one, then 2, then nearly a dozen patrons, each with a connection to military service. A young man identified himself as an Afghanistan veteran. An elderly couple mentioned their son serving in Iraq. A middle-aged woman revealed she was an army nurse. The restaurant had transformed into something unexpected, a gathering of witnesses to both disrespect and recognition. People who had remained silent during the initial confrontation now finding their voices. General Harrington surveyed the scene with approval, while Richard seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. He had never sought recognition for his actions. Duty and brotherhood had been motivation enough. As the impromptu gathering continued to grow, the restaurant's door opened once again. A group of 4 men in formal civilian attire entered, flanked by security personnel with earpieces, a congressional delegation that had arranged to dine with General Harrington. The senior aide approached the table hurriedly. "General, The secretary is here for your dinner meeting." All eyes turned to the entrance, where a distinguished man in his 60s surveyed the unusual scene before him. The Secretary of Defense had arrived, unaware he was about to walk into a situation charged with 5 decades of hidden history and newly exposed truths. Richard's eyes met the general's, a silent question passing between them. How much more complicated was this evening about to become? The Secretary of Defense paused at the threshold, taking in the unusual scene. A restaurant full of standing patrons, a soaking wet elderly veteran seated with General Harrington, and a manager whose complexion had gone from pale to ashen. He conferred briefly with an aide, then made his way directly to the table. "James," the secretary greeted General Harrington with familiarity, then turned his attention to Richard. "And who might this be?" General Harrington stood at attention despite the informal setting. "Mr. Secretary, may I present Colonel Richard Coleman, Medal of Honor recipient, 5th Special Forces Group." The secretary's eyebrows rose in recognition. "Colonel Coleman? From Hamburger Hill." He extended his hand without hesitation. "Sir, it is my profound honor." Richard rose shakily to his feet, his arthritic joints protesting after sitting in wet clothes. Nevertheless, his handshake was firm. "Mr. Secretary, the honor is mine. I've studied your actions at the military academy," the secretary continued, genuine respect evident in his voice. "Your case is still taught in tactical training." By now, the congressional delegation had joined them, creating a small crowd around the table. Richard, a man who had spent decades avoiding attention, found himself at the center of it. His discomfort was visible only to those who knew what to look for: the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his already impeccable posture. General Harrington recognized the signs immediately. "Perhaps we should all be seated," he suggested, gesturing to the surrounding tables. The colonel doesn't stand on ceremony. As the various dignitaries arranged themselves at nearby tables, Tyler approached with reinforcements, additional servers bearing fresh place settings, water glasses, and menus. The manager hovered nearby, desperation etched across his features. "General, we can move this gathering to our private dining room. It would be more comfortable." "We're perfectly comfortable right here," the general replied coldly, "in full view of everyone who witnessed how you treated Colonel Coleman earlier." Wilson's face flushed deep red. "There was a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," came a firm voice from a nearby table. It was the older woman who had offered her umbrella. "You told him, and I quote, 'The American Legion probably has cheap beer for you vets anyway.'" We all heard it. Murmurs of confirmation rippled through the onlookers. The Secretary of Defense fixed Wilson with a penetrating stare. "Is that true?" Wilson seemed to shrink under the collective gaze. It was a poor attempt at humor, sir." "There's nothing humorous about disrespecting veterans," one of the congressmen interjected, his voice carrying the distinct accent of a southern state. "Especially not one with the colonel's record." Richard raised a weathered hand. "If I may," he said quietly, commanding attention without raising his voice, a skill honed through years of leadership. "I didn't come here tonight seeking recognition or special treatment. I came to honor the anniversary of losing some good men." A reverent silence fell over the gathered crowd. "May 15th, 1969, General Harrington said softly. "Hill 937. Richard nodded, a flash of old pain crossing his features. "Sergeant Michael Davis. Lieutenant Thomas Warren. Corporal James Franklin. Today marks 50 years since they didn't make it home." The general reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. 3 young soldiers grinning beneath the Vietnamese sun, arms slung around each other's shoulders. "I keep this with me, every day for 50 years. Richard stared at the photograph, visibly moved. "You kept it all this time?" "They were my brothers too, Richard," the general said. "And I've spent 50 years trying to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. Worthy of what you did for us that day." The secretary cleared his throat. "Colonel Coleman, would you share with us what happened that day? Many here have only heard the official record." Richard hesitated, his eyes distant. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse, but then he began to speak, his voice low but clear. "We were pinned down near the summit. Heavy fire from 3 sides. The chopper coming in for extraction took a direct hit, went down hard, maybe 50 yards from our position. We could hear the survivors calling for help. The restaurant remained utterly silent as Richard continued, his words transporting everyone present to a hillside in Vietnam half a century earlier. Lieutenant Harrington here. He was my platoon leader, had taken shrapnel in both legs. Could barely walk. Ordered me to get the wounded ready for the next extraction and leave the down chopper crew. Said it was suicide to try for them. Richard paused, taking a sip of water. His hand, steady through decades of nightmares and memories, didn't tremble. I couldn't do that. Couldn't leave them calling for help. So I got the lieutenant stabilized, left him with our medic, and went for the chopper. First trip, I carried 2 men back, pilot and door gunner. Second trip was for the co-pilot. Third trip, he fell silent. Third trip was for me. General Harrington finished. I had ordered my men to retreat without me. Against my direct command, Colonel Coleman, then Sergeant Coleman, came back. Enemy fire was intensifying. He threw me over his shoulder like a sack of rice and ran through an active kill zone. An older veteran at a nearby table whispered, "Dear God." What the citations don't mention, the general continued, is that Richard had already been shot twice by then, through the shoulder and the leg. He was bleeding heavily but refused treatment until everyone was accounted for. Tyler, who had been standing transfixed nearby, suddenly straightened to attention and offered a perfect military salute to Richard. The gesture, unexpected from the young server, seemed to break a dam of emotion in the room. One by one, people rose to their feet. Veterans present rendered salutes. Civilians placed hands over hearts. The congressional delegation stood rigidly at attention. Richard, overwhelmed, tried to deflect. "Please, this isn't necessary." "With respect, Colonel," the secretary interrupted, "it is absolutely necessary. Our nation has a debt to you that can never be fully repaid." Wilson, the manager, had retreated to the periphery, shame evident in every line of his body. But as the impromptu ceremony continued, an elderly man with stooped shoulders approached him. "I'm Harold Davis," the man said quietly. "Sergeant Michael Davis was my son." Wilson's eyes widened in shock. "I come here every year on this date," Mr. Davis continued. "I've watched you turn away veterans before. Not just Colonel Coleman." The accusation hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. From across the room, Richard noticed the exchange. With effort, he rose from his chair and made his way to where they stood, each step measured against the pain in his damaged leg. "Mr. Davis," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I didn't know you were here." "Wouldn't miss it, Colonel," Davis replied, his grip firm despite his age. "Though I usually sit at the bar. Less conspicuous." Richard turned to Wilson. "Mr. Wilson, this is Harold Davis. His son saved my life before I could save others. Without Michael Davis, none of us would have made it off that hill." Wilson looked between the 2 elderly men, the magnitude of his misjudgment finally hitting him with full force. His carefully constructed world of status and appearance crumbled in the face of genuine valor and sacrifice. I don't know what to say," Wilson stammered. "You don't need to say anything," Richard replied without rancor. "Just remember that appearances don't define worth." The general approached, accompanied by the secretary and congressional delegation. "Mr. Davis," he greeted the elderly father, "your son's name is etched on the wall in D.C., but it's also etched in the hearts of everyone who served with him." Davis nodded, tears gathering in his lined face. "Thank you, General. That means more than you know." As the group stood together, the forgotten hero, the distinguished general, the grieving father, and the humbled manager, a young woman approached tentatively. She couldn't have been more than 20, with features that echoed Harold Davis's. "Grandpa," she said softly, "is this him? The man you told me about?" Davis turned, pride replacing sorrow in his expression. "Yes, Michelle, this is Colonel Coleman, the man who tried to save your uncle." The young woman extended her hand to Richard. "Sir, I've heard about you my entire life. My grandfather says you wrote to him every year after it happened." Richard took her hand gently. "Your uncle was one of the finest soldiers I ever knew. His sacrifice deserves remembrance." Michelle turned to the general and the assembled dignitaries. "My family has a tradition because of Colonel Coleman. Every Memorial Day, we read Uncle Michael's letters home. Then we read the annual letter from the colonel. For 50 years, he's never forgotten. Never missed a year." The secretary looked at Richard with new understanding. 50 years of letters? "It was the least I could do," Richard said simply. "I made it home. They didn't." The restaurant remained frozen in a moment of collective revelation, not just about Richard's heroism on a distant battlefield, but about his quiet, consistent honor in the decades since. The contrast between the initial disrespect he had endured and the profound respect he had earned hung in the air like a rebuke to everyone who had judged him by his worn clothes and humble demeanor. General Harrington broke the weighted silence. "Mr. Wilson, I believe your establishment owes Colonel Coleman more than an apology." Wilson nodded, his expression transformed by genuine remorse. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." He turned to Richard. "Colonel, I behaved unforgivably. There's no excuse for how I treated you." Richard regarded him steadily. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Wilson." "This wasn't a mistake," Wilson admitted. "It was prejudice, and I'm deeply ashamed." Before Richard could respond, the restaurant door opened once again. A group of uniformed soldiers entered, young men and women from the nearby military base, led by a staff sergeant who scanned the room until his eyes fell on Richard. "Colonel Coleman?" he called out. "Staff Sergeant Miller, sir. When we heard you were here." He snapped to attention and saluted sharply. Behind him, a dozen service members followed suit, a wall of respect standing rigid in the restaurant entrance. Richard returned the salute, confusion evident on his face. "At ease, Sergeant. How did you know I was here?" A young woman in civilian clothes near the bar raised her hand sheepishly, holding up her phone. "I posted it on social media, sir. My brother's deployed overseas, but he always told me about Colonel Coleman. When I realized it was you." The implications hung in the air. In the span of an hour, Richard Coleman had gone from being denied service to becoming the center of a spontaneous gathering of military and civilian admirers. His 5 decades of quiet dignity had suddenly been thrust into the spotlight. The general smiled broadly. "It seems your cover is blown, Richard." As current service members mingled with veterans, as congressional leaders spoke with reverence to a man they had never expected to meet, as a restaurant manager faced the consequences of judging worth by appearance, Richard Coleman stood in the center of it all, reluctant, dignified, and finally, after 50 years, truly seen. The following morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the previous evening's rain. Richard Coleman sat at his usual spot in the small diner 3 blocks from his modest apartment, nursing a cup of black coffee. The events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike in the harsh light of day. "More coffee, Colonel?" The waitress, Doris, had never called him by his rank before yesterday. Now she emphasized it with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "Just Richard is fine, Doris. Same as always." He smiled gently. "Not anymore," she replied, refilling his cup anyway. "My nephew's in the army. When he found out I've been serving coffee to a Medal of Honor recipient all these years and didn't even know it." She shook her head. "I should have recognized you. How could you? I never mentioned it." Richard stirred his coffee thoughtfully. It was a different lifetime. The bell above the diner door jingled. Richard didn't look up until a shadow fell across his table. Blake Wilson, the manager from Bellamy's, stood there awkwardly, holding a newspaper. "Colonel Coleman," he began hesitantly. "May I join you for a moment?" Richard gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Of course." Wilson sat down, placing the newspaper on the table. The front page featured a photograph taken at Bellamy's the night before. Richard standing at attention, returning the salute of the young soldiers who had arrived. "Forgotten hero remembered," Richard read the headline aloud, then shook his head. "Hardly forgotten. Just private." Wilson cleared his throat. "I came to apologize again, Colonel. What I did was inexcusable." "You've already apologized, Mr. Wilson." "I accepted then, and I accept now." "It's not enough," Wilson insisted. "I've spent the night thinking about why I acted that way. The truth is, I've become someone I don't recognize, judging people by their appearance, by what they can do for me or my restaurant's image." He looked down at his hands. "My father was a veteran. Korea. He would be ashamed of how I behaved." Richard considered the man across from him. "We all lose our way sometimes, Mr. Wilson." "Blake, please." "Blake," Richard amended. "The question is, what will you do now that you've recognized the problem?" Blake straightened his shoulders. "That's actually why I'm here. With your permission, I'd like to implement a new policy at Bellamy's. A reserved table, always available for veterans. No reservations needed. And a monthly dinner, free of charge, for veterans in need." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a commitment." "It's the right thing to do," Blake replied firmly. "And I'd like you to help me design it, to make sure we get it right." Before Richard could respond, the diner door opened again. General Harrington entered, this time in civilian clothes, pressed slacks, and a polo shirt that still somehow conveyed military bearing. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, joining them at the table. "You always were a creature of habit, Richard." Doris nearly dropped her coffee pot, rushing to fetch another cup for the general. Around the diner, other patrons began to whisper, recognizing both men from the news. "James," Richard acknowledged with a nod. "I thought you'd be in Washington by now." "Changed my plans," the general replied. "Some things are more important than meetings at the Pentagon." He turned to Blake. "Mr. Wilson, I see you've had the same idea I had, seeking out the colonel this morning." Blake shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. I was just discussing a new veterans program for the restaurant." "Commendable," the general approved, then focused on Richard. "But I'm here for a different reason. The secretary was quite moved by your story last night, Richard, particularly the part about the annual letters to Sergeant Davis's family." Richard shrugged. "It was private correspondence." "That's exactly the point," the general insisted. "For 50 years, you've quietly honored your promise without recognition or reward. While others sought glory or forgot their obligations entirely, you remained steadfast." "It wasn't difficult," Richard said simply. "They deserved to be remembered." The general exchanged a glance with Blake, who nodded imperceptibly. "Richard," the general continued, "the secretary has authorized me to inform you that the new Veteran Rehabilitation Center at Fort Benning will be named after you." Richard's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "That's unnecessary, James. The Coleman Center for Veteran Recovery." The general continued as if Richard hadn't spoken, focusing on both physical and psychological healing. "The secretary feels, and I agree, that your example of quiet strength and lifelong dedication represents exactly what we hope to instill." Richard set down his cup carefully. "There are others more deserving." "There really aren't," Blake interjected unexpectedly. "Colonel, forgive me for speaking out of turn, but after what I witnessed last night, the way everyone responded to you, from congressional leaders to young soldiers to Mr. Davis, you represent something we desperately need right now." The diner had fallen silent, patrons listening unabashedly to the conversation. "And what's that?" Richard asked quietly. "Integrity," Blake answered simply. "Doing the right thing not for recognition, but because it's right. For 50 years, you wrote to a fallen soldier's family. You honored your promises when no one was watching." Richard looked down at his weathered hands, the same hands that had carried wounded men through gunfire, that had penned countless letters of remembrance, that had built a quiet life of dignity when the war was over. "There's something else," the general added. "Michelle Davis, Sergeant Davis's niece, she's organizing a reunion. The surviving members of your unit, the families of those who didn't make it home. They want to gather on Veterans Day." "I'm not one for ceremonies, James. You know that." "It's not about ceremony," the general countered. "It's about connection. Those young soldiers who came to the restaurant last night, they need to hear your story directly from you. The world has changed, Richard. The wars are different, but the cost remains the same." Doris approached tentatively. "Colonel, sorry to interrupt, but there are some people here to see you." She gestured toward the door. Richard turned to find Tyler, the young server from Bellamy's, standing with 3 other young people approximately the same age. "Sir," Tyler began nervously, "I hope it's okay that we came looking for you. We wanted to thank you." Richard's brow furrowed. "Thank me? For what?" "My brother's deployed in Afghanistan," one of the young women explained. "After last night, I called him and told him what happened, how you were treated, and how everyone stood up afterward. He said it gave him hope." "Hope?" Richard echoed. "That people still care," Tyler explained. "That sacrifice still matters, even when it seems like the world has moved on or forgotten." Blake Wilson stood up suddenly. "Colonel, I need to get back to the restaurant, but I want you to know, your table will always be waiting for you at Bellamy's. Not because you're a hero, though you certainly are, but because every person deserves to be judged by their character, not their appearance." He extended his hand. "I hope you'll consider my offer to help design our veterans program." Richard shook the offered hand. "I'll consider it, Blake." As Blake left, the young people took his place, eager to hear Richard's stories. The general smiled, seeing his old friend surrounded by a new generation seeking wisdom and perspective. You can't hide anymore, Richard, he said quietly. The world needs what you have to offer. Throughout the day, the pattern continued. People came to the diner, veterans who had heard the news, civilians wanting to express gratitude, even a school teacher asking if Richard would speak to her history class about Vietnam. By afternoon, Richard found himself sitting with Harold Davis at the small park across from the diner. The two elderly men watched children playing on the swings, their laughter a counterpoint to the serious conversation. 50 years of letters, Davis mused. I never told you what they meant to my wife before she passed. Richard nodded silently. She used to say, as long as Colonel Coleman remembers Michael, our boy is never truly gone. Davis's voice cracked slightly. Those letters kept his memory alive, Richard. They were a lift.